I was 71 years old, standing barefoot on a cedar dock in the July heat, holding a silver reflector disc over my head so a photographer could bounce good light onto the faces of the people who had just told me I wasn't family. The lake was flat as a nickel behind them. Bunting hung off the boathouse rail, red and white, snapping a little in the wind. My son-in-law had his hand on my daughter's waist. His mother stood center, chin lifted, wearing the kind of white linen you can't sit down in. The photographer counted to 3 and everybody smiled, and the light I was holding landed on them warm and golden, and not one of them looked at me. I smiled too. Friends, I want you to know that, because folded in the chest pocket of my shirt, right against my ribs, was a piece of paper none of those people had ever bothered to read all the way to the end. Let me back up. My name is Walter Brennan. Folks call me Walt. I spent 38 years on the rails out of Spokane, most of it in the cab of a locomotive hauling grain and lumber down through the Palouse and out toward the coast. It's not glamorous work. It's cold in January and it's loud in every season, and it takes you away from your family for 4 days at a stretch. But it's honest, and it built a life. It bought a little brick house on Cannon Hill with a porch swing that squeaked no matter how much oil I put on it, and it put my daughter Claire through Gonzaga without a nickel of debt. My wife's name was Rosemary. 44 years. She was the kind of woman who wrote your birthday on the calendar in October so she'd have time to plan. 2 winters ago, she had a stroke in the kitchen while she was cutting up a chicken. I was in the garage. I heard the knife hit the floor before I heard her, and I've never once stopped hearing that sound. After she was gone, the house got very large and very quiet. I'd catch myself talking to her in the hallway. I'd make coffee for 2 out of pure muscle memory and then stand there looking at the second cup like it had insulted me. Grief doesn't hit you all at once, whatever people tell you. It leaks. It gets in through the little cracks in an ordinary Tuesday. Claire was 34 then, an administrator at Sacred Heart, sharp as a tack, the sort of person who could run a floor of nurses through a crisis without raising her voice. She'd married Trenton Ashford 3 years earlier. Trent, everybody called him. He was 36, boutique real estate development, which as far as I could tell meant he bought old brick buildings, put in glass and Edison bulbs, and rented them to dentists at a markup. He shook my hand too hard the first time we met, and he never once got my name wrong, and for a long while I thought that meant he liked me. His mother was Bitsy Ashford. That was the name she went by, a grown woman, 70 years old. She chaired the summer gala for the Horticultural Society, and she said the word gala the way other people say the word surgery. In April of that year, Claire called me on a Sunday morning, and I could hear her walking fast, the way she does when she's excited and can't sit still. "Dad," she said. "Dad, we found it. There's a place on Loon Lake. There's a dock, there's a boathouse, there's a fire pit, there's a room upstairs with a window that looks straight down the water, and I stood in it and I thought, this is where I want to be old. Now here's the part I need you to understand, because everything else comes from it. The Ashfords looked rich. They were not rich. I found that out later, but I suspected it earlier than I let on, because rich people don't talk about money the way Bitsy talked about money, constantly, and always about other people's. Trent's projects were leveraged to the eyebrows. Every dollar he had was tied up in a half-finished building on Sprague with a lien on it. When it came time to put money down on that lake house, his people had opinions and photographs and a decorator, and they did not have a check. The bank wanted 20% and a clean debt-to-income ratio, and Trent's ratio looked like a car wreck. Claire's salary alone couldn't carry it. They were 41 days from losing the property to a cash offer out of Seattle. So I sold the house on Cannon Hill. 40 years, the porch swing, the pencil marks on the pantry doorframe where I'd measured Claire every August. I sold it in 9 days to a young couple who cried when they signed. I moved into a 2-bedroom rental over on Grand with a view of a parking lot and a radiator that knocked. And I put the money into that lake house. Here is the thing I did right, friends, and I want you to hear it plain, because it is the only reason I'm not telling you a sadder story. I did not co-sign a bank loan. I did not hand them a gift and pat myself on the back. End quote. I sat down with a lawyer named Howard Kim, a man who charged me $400 for 2 hours and saved my entire life, and he said, "Walt, if you're going to be the money, then be the bank." So that's what I did. I carried the paper myself. I loaned them the down payment plus a chunk more, and it was written down as a promissory note, and that note was secured by a second deed of trust recorded against the property at the Stevens County Courthouse. Payments to me monthly, with interest set low enough to be a kindness and high enough to be real. And on page 3, in language Howard wrote and I read 4 times at my kitchen table, there was a clause, paragraph 9. Paragraph 9 said that if the borrowers sold the property, or refinanced it, or attempted to transfer or encumber the title without my written consent, the entire unpaid balance became due immediately. Not in installments. Immediately. In full. Trent signed it in a title office on a Thursday afternoon without reading past the number. I watched him do it. He clicked the pen twice, made a joke about carpal tunnel, and signed. The escrow officer was a woman named Ramona Diaz, mid-50s, reading glasses on a beaded chain, and she looked up at me over those glasses when the signing was done and gave me a small nod. Like one professional to another, like she'd seen 100 families do this the dumb way and here was one doing it right. That nod is going to matter. Hold on to it. They closed on the lake house in June. I drove up for the first weekend with my truck bed full of my own tools, and I spent 2 days on my knees rebuilding the dock stringers. Because the previous owner had let the joists go soft and nobody had noticed but me, I rehung the boathouse door. I got the old dock lights working. My back seized up so bad on Sunday night I had to sleep sitting in a chair. Claire brought me lemonade and sat on the boards next to me with her feet in the water, and she said, "I don't know how to thank you." "Don't," I said. "Just be happy in it." That was the summer everything was good. The drift started so slowly I couldn't have told you the week it began. It's like watching a train pull out. For the first few seconds you'd swear the platform is moving and not the train. The calls got shorter. Then they got scheduled, which is a strange thing between a father and a daughter. Then they got scheduled and canceled. There was always a reason, and every reason was a good one, and that's how you know something's wrong. When the reasons are all good, and they never stop coming. Trent changed too. Not dramatically. End quote. That's not how these things work. He started calling me Big Walt, which sounds friendly until you notice he only did it in front of other people. He started narrating me to strangers Walt used to drive trains. If you can believe it, in a tone like I was a piece of restored farm equipment on his lawn. When I said something at dinner, he'd wait a half beat and then say, "Anyway," and turn back to whoever he'd rather be talking to. And Bitsy took to that lake house like she'd bought it herself. She had the boathouse painted a color she called Harbor, which was gray. She put a monogrammed flag on the dock post. The letter was A. I saw that flag in a photo on Claire's phone in August, and I felt something turn over in my chest, and I said nothing. That was my mistake, and we'll get to it, because a young woman in a comment section is going to say it to me later, and she's going to be right. The invitation came at the end of May the following year. Claire called on a Tuesday evening while I was standing over the stove making one pork chop, which is a genuinely depressing amount of pork chop. She sounded rehearsed. "Dad, we're doing a big 4th of July at the lake. Both families. Trent's cousins are flying in, and we're having a photographer come out. We've never had a real family portrait done, and Bitsy knows a guy who shoots for the magazines. A family portrait." I stood there with a fork in my hand, and I felt about 11 years old. "I'd be honored, sweetheart," I said. "Come at 11, she said. "The photographer's set for noon, and we want the family shots done before everyone else gets there at 2. I hung up, and I stood in that kitchen, and I let myself be happy. That's a thing I've had to forgive myself for since. Being happy isn't foolish. Trusting people who share your blood isn't foolish. What's foolish is standing still after they've shown you. I spent a month getting ready for a barbecue, friends. I'm not proud of it, but I'm telling you the truth. I got a haircut on the 2nd of July from a barber who'd been cutting my hair since Nixon. I bought a new short-sleeve shirt, pale green, because Rosemary always said green was my color. I had my truck washed and vacuumed, and I paid the extra $4 for the tire shine, which I have never once in my life paid for, and I brought a gift. Out in my rental storage unit, I had a railroad lantern from the old Milwaukee Road, brass and glass. The real article, given to me by a conductor named Sam Petrosky in 1987, when he retired. I spent 3 evenings on it with polish and a toothbrush. I rewired it for a low-wattage bulb, and I mounted it on a piece of black walnut with a small plate that said, "Brennan, Ashford, EST, Loon Lake." It was meant to hang at the end of the dock, so anybody coming in after dark would know which house was theirs. I wrapped it in a moving blanket and set it on the floor of the truck so it wouldn't tip. The 4th was a perfect day. Blue and hot, the pines throwing off that hot sap smell, the road out of Spokane empty at 10 in the morning. I had the windows down and the radio on, and I remember thinking, this is a good day, Rosie. This is a day you would have liked. I got to the lake at 5 minutes to 11. The driveway was already full, and there were more cars than there should have been for a family portrait, a caterer's van, a florist's van, a black SUV with a photographer's ladder strapped to the roof. I pulled in behind the SUV and a young man in a polo came over and knocked on my window. Sir, we need this cleared for the vendors. There's overflow parking down at the turnout. The turnout was 400 yards back up the county road. Uphill, gravel. I said, I'm her father. He looked at his clipboard like my being her father might be on it. I'm just doing what I was told, sir. So I backed out and I parked at the turnout and I carried that lantern 400 yards in 88-degree heat with my bad shoulder, and I want to tell you I was fine. But by the time I got to the top of the drive, my shirt was stuck to my back and I could feel my pulse in my ears. Bitsy was on the front steps. White linen. A drink in her hand at 11 in the morning. Walter, she said, and she came down 2 steps and stopped, the way people do when they want to greet you without arriving at you. You found us. I did. Would you mind terribly going around by the boathouse path? The florist has the whole entry staged and I'd hate for anything to get knocked. And here, friends, is where I did the one thing that summer I'm still glad about. I stopped. I set the lantern down on the gravel. I looked her in the face and I said, Bitsy, I'm going to come in the front door. I'll be careful of the flowers. For about a second and a half, something moved behind her eyes. Then it was gone and she laughed like I'd said something charming. Of course, you are. HPTAU. And then she stepped sideways, just enough, and the florist assistant came out with an armload of hydrangea, and by the time I got around him, Bitsy had gone in and the moment had closed over like water. I went in the front door. I did it, and it didn't matter even a little bit, because they weren't insulting me with the door. They were insulting me with the whole day, and the door was just the first sentence of it. Inside, the house I had bought smelled like other people's cooking. Claire came out of the kitchen and hugged me, and she smelled like her mother's shampoo, and for a second I had my daughter back. She looked tired underneath the makeup. She said, You made it, and I said, Of course I made it. Dad, we're doing photos in about 20 minutes, so if you could just... I brought something, I said, for the doc. I unwrapped the lantern right there on the entry table. The brass caught the light. I'd polished it so hard, you could see the ceiling in it. Trent came through with a cooler on his shoulder and he glanced at it and said, Oh hey, cool, vintage, and he kept walking, and Claire said, Dad, that's... And then her phone went off and she said, Sorry, it's the caterer, and she took the lantern and set it on the entry table behind a spray of hydrangea, and by 2 o'clock that afternoon somebody had put a stack of cocktail napkins on top of it. That's not the part that broke me, but it's the part I think about at 3 in the morning. The photographer was a lean, loud young guy named Beck with a shaved head and 2 cameras around his neck. He got everybody moving toward the dock at 10 past noon. All right, immediate family first, then we'll open it up. Immediate family on the dock, everybody else give me some room. I walked down toward the dock with everyone else. The boards I'd rebuilt with my own hands were solid under my feet and warm from the sun. Bitsy was arranging people before Beck could. She put Trent's brother on the left. She put the cousins from Portland behind. She put Claire and Trent in the middle, and she stepped into the frame right beside her son and adjusted her necklace. I stood at the edge of the dock, waiting to be told where to go. Beck looked up from his camera and said, Sir, are you in this one? And Trent said pleasantly, easily, in that voice people use when they've decided in advance that no one will make a scene, This is just the immediate family, Walt. We'll get you in the group shot after. Immediate family. My daughter, standing 4 feet away, and his mother in the center of the frame. I looked at Claire. She looked at the water. That's the moment, friends. Right there. Not what came after. That's the moment a thing in my chest that had been holding on for 2 years finally let go of the rail. Sure, I said. And then Beck said, Hey, actually sir, could you do me a huge favor? Grab that reflector out of my bag. If you stand right about there and angle it up, it'll kill the shadow under the eyes. You'd be saving my life. He didn't mean anything by it. He was a kid, trying to do his job, with no assistant. He had no idea what he was handing me. But Trent laughed, and Bitsy said, "Oh, perfect. Walter's useful." And Claire said nothing at all. So I took the silver disc out of the canvas bag and I stood 3 feet outside the frame, in the sun, and I held it up over my head at the angle the kid showed me, and I lit them. 25 minutes. I counted later off the timestamps on the pictures Claire eventually showed me. 25 minutes of holding a light up so that the people who had just told me I wasn't family would look their best in the record of it. My shoulder started shaking around minute 9. Sweat ran into my eye and I couldn't wipe it. And they smiled and shifted and laughed at Beck's jokes, and somebody's cousin said, "One more with the dog." And I stood there lighting them. You want to know what I thought about? I thought about Rosemary at that kitchen sink. I thought about how I'd never once in 44 years walked into a room and had to wonder if I was welcome in it. And I thought, God, Rosie, look what I let happen to me. I want to ask you something before I tell you what happened next, because I've thought about it every day since. Have you ever been the one holding the light? Have you ever stood just outside your own family's picture? Tell me where you're watching from, friends. I'd like to know I'm not the only one. When Beck finally said, "Got it," I put the reflector back in the bag. Nobody said, "Thank you." Beck did. Beck said, "Thank you." I needed to get away from people for a minute, so I went around behind the boathouse where I'd stacked the old cedar shingles the summer before. There's a bench back there in the shade. I sat down and I put my head in my hands and I let myself shake. And that's when I heard them. 2 voices, coming down the side path, maybe 15 feet away, on the other side of the boathouse wall. They had no idea I was there. Sound comes strange around water. It slides right along the surface and hands you things you were never supposed to have. Bitsy, honestly, Trenton, he cannot be in the formal one. It's a keepsake. It goes on the wall. Trent, I know. I handled it. Bitsy, the man carried a lunchbox for a living. Trent laughed. My son-in-law laughed at that, friends. I heard it through a wall. Then he said, "It's fine. It's a season. Once the Sprague building leases up, we refinance in the fall, and Dad's little IOU gets rolled into the new loan and paid off, and then he's just Claire's father. He's not on anything. He doesn't get a vote." Bitsy, does he understand that? Trent, he doesn't need to understand it. It's paperwork. He signed a thing at a title office. He probably thinks it's a birthday card. Claire handles him. My, and then Bitsy said the line I will hear until I die. Well, he got a nice long look at the lake today. That's more than most people get. Their voices moved off toward the fire pit. End quote. End quote. I sat on that bench in the shade, and something happened to me that I can only describe as the temperature dropping. All the hurt went out of me, and something cold and clear came in behind it. My hands stopped shaking. So, my breathing evened out, because Trent had just told his mother out loud, in a place he thought was private, exactly what he intended to do. He intended to refinance in the fall. He intended to pay me off and cut me loose without a conversation. And he did not know what was in paragraph 9. I stood up. I tucked my shirt in. I walked back around the boathouse into the party. By 2:30, there were maybe 60 people on that lawn. Caterers, a keg, kids in the shallows, a cornhole set. Trent was holding court by the grill with a beer, telling a story with his hands. And sitting at a picnic table under the big ponderosa, in a sun hat, with a plate of potato salad, was Ramona Diaz. I stopped walking. She saw me, and her whole face opened up. "Mr. Brennan, Walt," it turned out, and this is the kind of thing that only happens in a place the size of Loon Lake. Ramona and her husband had bought the property 2 doors down that spring. Trent had invited the whole road. He'd shaken her hand at the mailboxes in April and never once connected the woman at the barbecue with the woman who'd sat across a closing table from him in a title office 14 months before. People like Trent don't remember escrow officers. They're furniture. She patted the bench and I sat down, and a woman across the table, one of Bitsy's gala friends, Pearls, 70, said, "Now, how do you two know each other?" Ramona said, "Oh, I closed this house. The woman said, "This house? The Ashford's house?" And Ramona Diaz, God bless her, put down her fork, looked up, and said in a perfectly pleasant, perfectly clear voice that carried about 30 feet across a quiet lawn, "Well, it's the Brennan Ashford house, really." Walt carried the paper on it. "He's the bank. I want you to understand what happened to that lawn. It didn't go silent, all at once. It went silent in a wave, the way a breeze crosses a wheat field." The gala woman said, "I'm sorry, he's the what?" And Ramona, who had spent 30 years explaining documents to people who don't read them, said, "He financed it. Second position, recorded note. Without Mr. Brennan, there's no house. The bank wouldn't touch the deal on their numbers alone. They were about 6 weeks from losing the property." Somebody's beer bottle clinked down on a table. I felt Trent before I saw him. He came across that grass fast. "Okay," he said, loud and grinning, the grin nailed on. "Ramona, that's private financial information, and I don't think—" "Is it?" I said. I hadn't raised my voice. "I've spent my life around engines. You learn that the loudest thing in the room is almost never the strongest thing in the room." Trent turned in two, and I saw it hit him, the calculation, the running of numbers behind his eyes. "Walt," he said, "buddy, let's go inside." And, "No, I don't think so," I said. "I like it out here. I built that dock." Bitsy arrived at his shoulder in her white linen. "Walter, you are causing a scene." "Ma'am," I said, "I've been quiet since 11 o'clock this morning. I held a light over my head for 25 minutes, so you'd photograph well. I've been about as far from a scene as a man can get." And then I reached into my chest pocket and I took out the folded paper. I'd carried a copy of that note in my truck since the day it was recorded. Not because I was suspicious, because it was the only proof left in the world of what I'd done for my daughter. And some nights I'd unfold it at the kitchen table just to look at it, the way you'd look at a photograph. Now it was something else. I unfolded it and I held it out to him, and I said the 5 words I'd been assembling in my head since I stood up off that bench behind the boathouse. "Read paragraph 9, son." He didn't take it, so I read it to him, out loud, in front of 60 people, in a flat voice, the way a dispatcher reads a work order. I read him the part that said, "Any sale, transfer, refinance, or further encumbrance of the property, without my prior written consent, accelerates the entire, unpaid balance, due and payable in full, immediately. You've got a construction loan on Sprague," I said. "Cross-collateralized, I'd bet, because that's how those go. You go. When your lender pulls title on this property for your fall refinance, they will find me sitting in second position with an acceleration clause and a recorded interest, and I will not be consenting, not in the fall, not next spring." Trent's face did something I'd never seen a face do. It went white in patches. "You wouldn't," he said. "Son, I heard you behind the boathouse." That's all I said. And I watched him replay the whole conversation in his head in about 2 seconds, and I watched him get to his mother's line about the lake, and I watched him understand. Claire had come across the grass. She was standing at the edge of it with both hands over her mouth. "Daddy," she said. She hadn't called me that in 15 years. "Sweetheart," I said, "I'm not going to fight with you at a party. I'm going to go home now. My lawyer's name is Howard Kim. Have your husband call him Monday." End quote. And then I did one more thing, and I'll admit to you it wasn't strictly necessary, but I'm human. I walked up to the entry table, moved the cocktail napkins off my father-in-law's lantern, Sam Petrosky's lantern, 40 years of my life polished into that brass, picked it up, tucked it under my arm, and carried it back down that 400-yard gravel road to my truck. Nobody followed me. Nobody said a word. I sat in the driver's seat with the AC blowing and my hands on the wheel for a long time before I could turn the key, and then I drove home through the pines with the windows down. Now, here's where I have to tell you something about what I did next, because a lot of stories like this end with the old man burning the whole thing to the ground, and I didn't do that. I could have. Howard Kim laid it out for me the following Tuesday. The acceleration was clean. It was recorded. It was signed. It was enforceable. If I called the note and they couldn't pay and they could not pay, not with the Sprague building half leased, I could have forced the sale of that lake house and taken every dollar I was owed off the top. But Howard also said something I've thought about a lot since. He said, "Walt, before you do anything, You need to decide who you're aiming at. Because it was never Claire's money. It was hers and his, and they were one thing, and the law doesn't care that only one of them held a light over his head at a barbecue. So here's what I did. That Monday I sent one letter, certified, to both of them. It was 3 paragraphs. It said that I was formally withholding consent to any refinance, transfer, or further encumbrance of the property. It said the monthly payments under the note were to continue on schedule. And it said that I would be reviewing my position again in 90 days. That's all. I didn't call the note. I just took my hand off the door and let them see that the door had always had a lock on it. 90 days is a long time when you're leveraged. I found out how the rest of it went in pieces, the way you find things out in a small state where everybody knows everybody. Trent's lender pulled title in September for the fall refinance and found the recorded second and the acceleration clause and my letter of non-consent, and they declined to proceed. Without that refinance, he couldn't pull the equity out of the lake house, and without that equity, he couldn't finish the build-out on Sprague, and his general contractor walked in October over unpaid draws. He lost the building in February. It's a self-storage place now, which I think about sometimes with an uncharitable amount of pleasure. Bitsy Ashford ran the Horticultural Society Gala for 11 years. She did not run it for a 12th. I was told by Ramona, who hears everything, that the committee decided to rotate leadership. I was also told that the story of a 71-year-old man being handed a reflector at his own daughter's house went through that committee like a grass fire. 3 separate women in that town called me at home, friends. 2 of them cried. One of them said, "Walt, my son's wife did nearly the same thing to me at a christening, and I never said one word, and I'm 81 years old and I still wake up angry." That's when I understood this wasn't only my story. And Claire, I didn't hear from my daughter for 6 weeks. I want to be honest with you about how that felt. It felt like a second widowhood. It. Then in the middle of August, she showed up at my rental on Grand at 7 in the morning with 2 coffees, and she looked like she hadn't slept in a month, and she said, "Can I come in?" She did not grovel. I want to say that clearly, because I think it's the only reason we're still speaking today. She sat at my little table and she said, "I'm not going to ask you to forgive me. I watched it happen. I saw him say immediate family, and I looked at the water. I've watched myself look at the water about 4,000 times since." I said, "Why? Why?" And she said, "Because for 3 years the price of peace in my house was you being smaller, and I paid it every time. I told myself it was easier for you if I didn't make it a fight. That was a lie I told because it was easier for me." Then she put a folder on my table. She'd gone to a lender on her own. She'd had the property appraised, run her own numbers, and gotten preliminary approval to refinance the entire thing in her name alone, Trent off title, off the note, out using her salary, and a hard look at what she could actually afford, which was less house and more truth. And she had a payment schedule, printed, for what she owed me. Every dollar, 61 months. "I'm not asking you to consent to anything today," she said. "I'm asking you to look at it, and I want you to know I filed on Tuesday." She meant the divorce. She started sending checks. In November. The first one came in an envelope with a photograph in it, me and her mother at Priest Lake in 1994, both of us sunburned, Rosemary laughing with her hand up to block the camera. I didn't cash it. I didn't cash any of them. I put them in the drawer of my nightstand and I let them stack up, and every month for 2 years I watched my daughter, who was living in a 1-bedroom and driving a Corolla with 190,000 miles on it, send her father money she'd earned herself. She never once missed. Not 1 month. Not the month her transmission went out. On the 2nd anniversary of that 4th of July, I drove up to the lake with a shoebox with 24 uncashed checks in it, and I set it on her counter, and I said, "You've paid me." She said, "That's not paid. That's 24 out of 61. And I said, "Sweetheart, you paid me in the first 4. The rest was just you proving it to yourself, and I've never needed the proof as bad as you did." She cried, standing up, the way her mother used to. That's the part people always want to skip to. But I want to be careful here, because I don't want anybody hearing this to think it was easy or that it was fast or that a hug fixed it. It took 2 years of small things. It took her showing up. It took me learning to say, "That hurt me," out loud on the day it happened instead of 18 months later. Forgiveness isn't a door you open. It's a road you resurface 100 feet at a time. And, end quote. There's a photograph on the wall of that lake house now. We took it last summer, the two of us and Ramona and her husband and a few neighbors, on the dock I rebuilt. Beck, the photographer, came back out. He remembered me. First thing he did when he got out of his car was walk over, shake my hand and say, "Sir, you are not touching a reflector today. I'm in the middle of that picture." My daughter's got her arm through mine. The old Milwaukee Road lantern is hanging off the dock post where it should have been all along, and the flag with the A on it went in a trash bag a long time ago. I'm going to leave you with the only thing I actually know, friends, after 73 years and one very bad barbecue. I used to think respect was something you were owed for what you'd given. 2. I gave a house, so I was owed a place in the picture. That's arithmetic, and families are not arithmetic. Nobody has ever been loved into a photograph because their name was on a deed. What I know now is this: a family is not the people who share your last name. A family is the people who make room in the frame. And if you find yourself standing outside of it, holding up a light so that everyone else looks warm, put the light down, not in anger, not to punish anybody. Put it down because a man who spends his life illuminating other people has a right to be seen too. I stood behind that camera for 25 minutes because I was waiting for my daughter to turn around and say, "Dad, get in here, you belong in this." She didn't. And so I stopped waiting, and I spoke with the only voice they'd never bothered to read. Paragraph 9. If you've got somebody in your life who only calls you family when the check clears, I'd like to hear about it. And tell me honestly, because I still don't know the answer myself. Should respect in a family be automatic, or does everybody have to earn it every single year? I'll be reading. I've got the time now.